What happens when love collides with loyalty? When a woman's heart is torn between her faithful husband and the man who once tried to destroy him? This is not just a story of betrayal, it is a story of choices, hidden desires, and the haunting silence of regret. It was a quiet evening in the small countryside town, where the air always smelled of fresh earth, and the sky stretched endlessly above golden fields. In a modest wooden house at the edge of the village, Maria lived with her husband, Daniel. Daniel was a man admired by many, a farmer by profession, strong, honest, and unshakably loyal. He had married Maria 3 years earlier, and though their life was not rich with wealth, it was filled with warmth and devotion. Maria was beautiful, the kind of beauty that seemed effortless, like wildflowers swaying in the breeze. Her kindness matched her looks, and her laughter was a melody Daniel treasured more than any harvest from his land. To the neighbors, they were the perfect couple, man and woman bound not by luxury, but by love. But perfection in this world rarely lasts. There was a shadow lurking in their past, one that neither of them spoke about openly. Years ago, before Maria and Daniel had married, there had been a bitter rivalry between Daniel and another man, Alexander. The conflict had started with land disputes, but it had grown into something deeper, an enmity filled with jealousy, pride, and old wounds that refused to heal. Alexander had once sworn to ruin Daniel's life. He left the village for some years, and the people thought he would never return. But shadows have a way of creeping back. One autumn morning, news spread across the town. Alexander had come back. He was no longer the reckless young man people remembered. Time had shaped him differently. His face was hardened with experience, his presence darker, more mysterious. But most of all, he carried with him a strange aura, something that drew attention, something that unsettled Maria when she first saw him again. Daniel, however, paid little heed. He trusted his own strength, his land, and his wife's devotion. He believed that no enemy, no matter how bitter, could break the foundation of what he and Maria had built. But hearts are not walls of stone, and love does not always follow the rules of loyalty. Maria's first encounter with Alexander was unexpected. She had gone to fetch water from the well near the town square. Then there he stood, leaning against the wooden post with a faint smirk. His voice was calm, almost disarming. "Maria," he said, as though her name had never left his memory. She froze for a moment, uncertain whether to greet him or turn away. He spoke again, softer this time. "It's been a long time." Something stirred within her, a confusion she couldn't quite explain. She told herself it was nothing, just the ghost of an old rivalry, the tension of seeing her husband's enemy face to face. But deep down a question whispered, "Why does his voice feel so familiar? Why does his gaze feel so heavy?" That night Maria could not sleep. She lay beside Daniel, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and tried to push the memory away. But Alexander's face lingered in her mind, like an unwelcome shadow stretching across the quiet of her home. What begins as a fleeting encounter soon turns into a dangerous thread of connection. But can a single glance unravel years of loyalty and trust? She had told herself countless times that he meant nothing, that he was simply a bitter memory from Daniel's past. And yet, every time she walked through the town, her eyes searched the crowd almost unconsciously, as though expecting to see him again. It did not take long for that expectation to be fulfilled. One afternoon, while Maria carried a basket of vegetables back from the market, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Let me help you with that." His presence commanding, his eyes carrying both fire and calm. Without waiting for permission, He lifted the basket from her hands with ease. "I didn't ask for your help," Maria said firmly, her heart racing. "You didn't need to," Alexander replied. "But I gave it anyway. You know what you've done to my husband? You know the history?" "I know," Alexander admitted, his tone surprisingly soft. "But I also know that time changes people." "I didn't come back to fight, Daniel." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "Sometimes I wonder if I came back for something else entirely." She turned quickly and walked away, telling herself she would never allow him to speak to her like that again. But his words clung to her mind like thorns, scratching at the edges of her thoughts. That night, Daniel was cheerful, speaking about his plans for the farm, his hopes for the next season's harvest, and the dreams he carried for the two of them. Maria smiled, nodded, pretended to listen. But inside, she was distracted, caught between the warmth of her husband's devotion and the dangerous pull of Alexander's voice. Weeks passed, and fate seemed to play cruel games. Each time Maria thought she could avoid him, Alexander appeared at the market near the church. Along the road where the wildflowers grew, he never pushed too far, never spoke in ways that could be openly condemned, but his presence itself was enough. He would ask simple questions about her day, her life, her happiness. Questions Daniel rarely asked, not because he didn't care, but because he assumed he already knew the answers. Maria began to notice things she hadn't before, yet in the silence of her heart, she did. One rainy evening, Maria found herself standing by the old well again. She had gone out to clear her head, but the storm forced her to take shelter. "You shouldn't be here," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "And yet, you came," Alexander replied, stepping closer. The storm raged above them, thunder cracking across the sky, rain cascading down in relentless sheets. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in the chaos. Maria's heart pounded with fear and something else she dared not name. Alexander leaned closer, his voice almost lost in the storm. "You don't have to say anything. I can see it in your eyes." Maria pulled back, clutching the edge of her shawl. "You're my husband's enemy. I should hate you." She had no answer. None that could silence the storm within her. The closer she moves toward danger, the harder it becomes to escape. Maria tried to convince herself that what happened by the well had meant nothing. It was only a moment, born out of a storm, a weak moment. She repeated this in her mind every night, hoping the mantra would free her. But deep down, she knew it was a lie. She began noticing small changes in herself, changes Daniel didn't miss. She grew quieter, her laughter less frequent, her eyes often distant. Daniel would ask, "Maria, are you all right?" And she would always reply, "Yes, I'm just tired." He trusted her too much to dig deeper, but his heart felt the shift. Alexander, however, noticed even more. He had a way of reading her silences. He would not always speak when they crossed paths. Sometimes he would simply stand there, letting his gaze speak louder than words. Those unspoken exchanges frightened Maria more than anything else. It wasn't what he said, it was what she felt. One afternoon, as Maria hung wet laundry in the backyard, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning sharply, she saw Alexander leaning against the wooden fence, his eyes fixed on her. She gasped, "You shouldn't be here." She whispered urgently, "I had to see you," he said simply. "If Daniel," she began, panic rising in her chest. "I don't care about Daniel right now. I only care about you." His words cut through her defenses like a blade. She wanted to shout, to tell him to leave, to never return. But the truth lodged in her throat, refusing to escape. Instead, she turned away, gripping the wet cloth so tightly her knuckles whitened. Alexander stepped closer. "Tell me to leave and I will." "What?" "Look me in the eyes and say you feel nothing, and I'll never trouble you again." Maria's lips trembled. She wanted to say it, but her voice betrayed her. Silence hung between them, heavy and damning. From inside the house, Daniel's voice suddenly called out, "Maria? Who are you talking to?" She froze, her heart nearly stopping. But when she turned, Alexander had vanished into the trees, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves behind. That night, Maria sat by the fire, her hands trembling as she sewed a torn piece of cloth. Daniel watched her carefully. "You've been restless lately," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "I'm fine," she insisted, forcing a smile. Daniel studied her face for a long time before nodding slowly. He didn't press further, but in his silence lay suspicion, a quiet storm building. Days turned into weeks, and Maria's torment deepened. She was caught in a war between loyalty and desire, torn apart by the weight of her secret. Alexander's presence haunted her dreams, while Daniel's kindness filled her with unbearable guilt. One evening, Maria attended the village gathering at the church. Music played, children laughed, and the townsfolk danced under the lantern light. Daniel stepped away to speak with a neighbor, leaving Maria alone near the edge of the crowd. That was when she felt it, that piercing gaze she knew too well. She turned and saw Alexander standing in the shadows, his eyes locked on hers. Without a word, he tilted his head slightly, signaling her to follow. Maria's breath quickened, her heart pounding as if it would burst from her chest. She hesitated, torn between fear and a longing she could no longer deny. Slowly, as though guided by a force beyond her control, she walked away from the lights of the gathering and into the darkness where Alexander waited. When she reached him, he spoke in a low voice. "Every day, I fight myself to stay away. But I can't. Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll disappear." Maria's lips parted, but no denial came. Instead, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Alexander raised his hand, brushing it away with a gentleness that shook her to her core. For the first time, Maria allowed herself to lean closer just enough for the world around her to vanish. And in that moment, under the silence of the night, she crossed the line she swore she never would. Secrets can only hide for so long. When the truth begins to surface, love turns into a battlefield where every choice demands a sacrifice. The night Maria let herself fall into Alexander's arms, she returned home trembling, her heart divided into two broken halves. Daniel was already asleep, his face peaceful under the dim glow of the oil lamp. She stood by the doorway, watching him, guilt crashing over her like relentless waves. She wanted to confess, to fall at his feet and beg for forgiveness, but fear sealed her lips. Instead, she crawled silently into bed, staring into the darkness until dawn broke. From that night onward, nothing remained the same. Maria carried her secret like a burning coal hidden beneath her skin. Each time Daniel touched her hand, her body stiffened with shame. Each time he looked into her eyes, she was terrified he might see the truth. But Daniel was no fool. Though he said nothing, he had begun to notice the distance in her gaze, the way her mind wandered, the faint traces of unease that lingered in her smile. At first he thought it was the stress of daily life, perhaps loneliness, while he worked long hours on the farm. But then he remembered Alexander, the enemy who had suddenly returned, the man whose shadow had haunted him for years. Suspicion grew in his heart like a poisonous vine. He began watching more closely, noticing how Maria avoided speaking of the market, how she grew flustered when his name was mentioned among neighbors, how her face paled at the sound of certain footsteps. Daniel's chest tightened with a fear he did not want to name. One evening, as Daniel walked home along the dirt path from the fields, he caught sight of something that froze his blood. At the edge of the woods, hidden among the trees, Maria stood with Alexander. They weren't touching, but the closeness of their bodies, the intensity in their silence, said more than words ever could. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his breath ragged, the world tilting beneath him. He wanted to rush forward, to demand answers, to drag Alexander away and end the rivalry once and for all. But instead, he turned back quietly, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails cut into his skin. That night, Daniel said nothing, simply lay in bed beside Maria, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath. He stared at the ceiling, wide awake, his mind ablaze with anger, betrayal, and unbearable sorrow. The following days were filled with tension, so thick it suffocated the air in their home. Daniel spoke less, his words sharp and clipped. Maria noticed, but she dared not ask. Her silence, her avoidance, only confirmed his darkest fears. Finally, one stormy night, Daniel could no longer contain himself. As thunder shook the sky, he turned to Maria, his voice trembling but fierce. "How long will you keep this from me? How long will you pretend?" Maria froze, her eyes wide. "Daniel, I don't lie to me," he roared, slamming his hand against the table. "I saw you. With him, my enemy. My blood turns cold knowing you let him near you." Tears welled in Maria's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I never wanted this. I tried to fight it. But her voice broke into sobs. "Can't explain it." Daniel's face twisted with pain, his heart shattering with every word. "You gave your heart to the man who swore to destroy me, the man who lived to see me fall. And he could not finish." His voice cracked into silence. Outside, the storm raged, lightning illuminating their faces, one etched with fury and heartbreak, the other drenched in guilt and despair. At that very moment, a knock thundered on the door. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he opened it, only to find Alexander standing there, rain dripping from his cloak, his gaze steady and unflinching. "We need to talk," Alexander said firmly. The room fell silent, charged with the weight of an inevitable confrontation. Three hearts, bound by love and betrayal, stood on the edge of a reckoning that would change everything forever. The storm outside howled like an angry spirit as Alexander stepped into the small wooden house. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, rage boiling in his veins. Maria stood frozen between them, her heart pounding, her tears flowing freely. "You have no right to be here," Daniel growled, his voice thick with fury. "I'm not here to fight you," Alexander replied calmly, though his eyes never left Maria's. "I came because there are truths that can't be hidden any longer." Daniel's face darkened. "You dare stand in my house and speak of truth? You who swore to ruin me, you who stole the loyalty of my wife." "I didn't steal anything," Alexander said firmly. "I never forced her. She came to me because something in her heart called to mine. If that is a crime, then I am guilty." "But so is she," Maria gasped, her hands trembling. "Please stop this." I never wanted either of you to suffer. I never wanted to hurt Daniel, but my heart. She broke down, her sobs filling the small room. My heart betrayed me. The silence that followed was unbearable. The rain pounded harder against the roof, and the flickering lamp cast jagged shadows across their faces. Daniel looked at Maria, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His voice finally broke the silence, low and hollow. You could have betrayed me with anyone else, Maria, anyone, but you chose him, and my enemy. Do you know what that means? Maria fell to her knees, clutching her hands together. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask you to believe that I never wanted this. Alexander stepped forward, his voice steady. If you want me gone, Daniel, say the word. I will leave this village tonight, never to return. But no, this your wife's heart will never forget me. You can cage her body, but her soul is no longer yours. Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing the knife from the wooden table. The sharp edge glistened in the dim light. Maria screamed, rushing between them. No, please, no. For a tense moment, time seemed to stop. Daniel's eyes blazed with the fury of a man betrayed. Yet beneath the fire lay a well of sorrow so deep it threatened to drown him. His hand shook, the knife trembling in his grip. Then, with a cry torn from his soul, he hurled the blade across the room. It clattered against the far wall, harmless but deafening. Daniel turned away, his shoulders heavy with defeat. I cannot kill you, Alexander. You are not worth the stain of your blood on my hands. But no, this sigh cursed the day you returned, and I cursed the weakness that drew her to you. Maria reached for him, but he stepped back, his eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. You were my world, Maria, and now I don't know what you are. With that, Daniel walked out into the storm, the door slamming behind him. Maria collapsed to the floor, her sobs racking her body. Alexander knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder but not daring to touch. He may leave you, but I will not, he whispered. But Maria shook her head violently. You don't understand. I've lost him, and without him I've lost myself. The storm outside eventually faded into silence, but inside, the wreckage remained. Maria sat in the ruins of her choices, her heart torn between the man she had betrayed and the man she could never truly have. And so the story ended, not with love fulfilled, nor with vengeance satisfied, but with a haunting truth. Some wounds never heal, and some choices can never be undone.